Hey guys, welcome back to another Atlas Archives deep dive, where tonight we're venturing into Iraq, a country that's been making headlines for 5,000 years, though admittedly not always for the reasons its tourism board would prefer. This is the land between two rivers, where humans first figured out that writing things down might be more reliable than trying to remember everything, and where the concept of civilization itself took its first tentative steps. From the ancient ziggurats of Babylon to the modern complexities of Baghdad, Iraq's story reads like the world's longest-running political drama, complete with plot twists that would make Shakespeare jealous. We'll explore how the same geographical features that enabled the first cities also created challenges that persist today, and discover why Mesopotamian farmers dealt with remarkably similar problems to contemporary Iraqi agriculture ministers. If you're new here, drop a comment telling us which time zone you're listening from. Our community spans more countries than the ancient Persian Empire, which is saying something. And here's the thing. If you find yourself oddly fascinated by how irrigation systems connect to political revolutions, you might just be our kind of person. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our upcoming journey through the rest of the world's most historically complex nations. Now, find your most comfortable position and prepare for a journey through time that covers everything from humanity's first urban planners to why controlling water rights remains more valuable than oil. This is Iraq. Chapter 1. Ancient Mesopotamia and Early Civilizations. Picture, if you will, a time when the most advanced technology was a really good stick, and the height of urban planning was making sure your mud brick house wasn't directly downwind from your neighbour's goat pen. This was ancient Mesopotamia, nestled between two rivers whose names you probably learned in school and promptly forgot until this very moment. The land we now call Iraq sits in the heart of what ancient Greeks called Mesopotamia, literally meaning between the rivers. These rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, flow from the mountains of Turkey down through Syria and Iraq before eventually meeting and emptying into the Persian Gulf. Think of them as nature's own irrigation system, except instead of watering your garden tomatoes, they watered the birth of human civilization. No pressure there. Around 8,000 years ago, while most of humanity was still figuring out which end of a spear was the pointy bit, the people of southern Mesopotamia were already building the world's first cities. These were the Sumerians, and they had the audacity to invent pretty much everything that makes modern life possible. Writing, the wheel, beer, mathematics, organized government. Basically, if you've ever enjoyed any of these things, you owe a Sumerian a thank you note. The geography that made this possible was quite remarkable, really. The annual flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates left behind rich, fertile silt that was perfect for agriculture. It was like having Mother Nature personally deliver premium fertilizer to your doorstep every spring, except the delivery truck was a massive, potentially destructive flood that could wipe out entire settlements if you weren't careful. The Mesopotamians learned to work with these floods, creating elaborate canal systems that would make a modern civil engineer weep with professional jealousy. The earliest Sumerian cities emerged around 3500 BCE in the southern region known as Sumer. Cities like Uruk, Ur, Eridu, and Lagash rose from the marshlands like ancient versions of Las Vegas, except instead of gambling and showgirls, they had temple complexes and really impressive accounting systems. Uruk, in particular, grew to house perhaps 50,000 people by 3000 BCE, making it quite possibly the largest city in the world at the time. Imagine trying to explain to a time-travelling hunter-gatherer that 50,000 people could live in one place without immediately eating all the local wildlife and starving. These Sumerian cities were dominated by massive temple complexes called ziggurats. essentially pyramids with commitment issues that never quite decided how tall they wanted to be. The most famous was probably the ziggurat at Ur, which stood about 70 feet high and served as both a religious centre and a very impressive way to show neighbouring cities that your god was clearly superior to theirs. "Oh, your temple is only 40 feet tall? How quaint," the Urites presumably sneered, while polishing their superior ziggurats. Sumerian society was remarkably sophisticated for its time, though their idea of a good time might seem a bit strange to us today. They invented cuneiform writing, initially to keep track of beer rations and sheep ownership, proving that even in the dawn of civilization, the most important things were alcohol and property rights. The earliest known written story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, comes from this period and tells the tale of a king who was 2/3 god and 1/3 human, which raises uncomfortable questions about divine mathematics that we're probably better off not exploring too deeply. The Sumerians also gave us the world's first known legal code, created by Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE. This was several centuries before Hammurabi's more famous code, making Ur-Nammu the world's first lawyer, a profession that has been making people nervous ever since. The code established the principle that punishments should fit crimes, though some of the specific punishments would probably violate several modern human rights conventions. Religion played a central role in Sumerian life, with each city-state having its own patron deity who was essentially the ultimate city manager. The god owned everything, the priests managed it all, and the common people did most of the actual work. A system that sounds suspiciously familiar to anyone who's ever worked in a large corporation. The Sumerians believed their gods created humans specifically to do the farming and maintenance work that the gods themselves found tedious, which explains a great deal about the human condition, really. Around 2300 BCE, the Sumerian city-states were conquered by Sargon of Akkad, creating the world's first multi-ethnic empire. Sargon was apparently quite good at the whole conquering business, uniting the Sumerian cities under Akkadian rule and establishing a dynasty that lasted for over 150 years. The Akkadians adopted Sumerian culture wholesale, while adding their own language and administrative systems, creating a fusion civilization that was part Sumerian innovation and part Akkadian ambition. The Akkadian Empire eventually collapsed around 2150 BCE, possibly due to climate change, internal rebellions, or simply the universal historical principle that all empires eventually get too big for their administrative britches. This collapse led to a brief Sumerian revival before the region was taken over by the Babylonians, who proved that sometimes the student really can surpass the teacher. The rise of Babylon around 2000 BCE marked a new phase in Mesopotamian civilization. The city, located on the Euphrates River roughly where modern-day Baghdad now sits, became the region's dominant power under the rule of Hammurabi around 1750 BCE. Hammurabi is best remembered for his legal code, which established the famous principle of an eye for an eye, though thankfully, most modern legal systems have evolved beyond literal body part exchanges for justice. Babylonian civilization reached remarkable heights of mathematical and astronomical achievement. They developed a sophisticated understanding of astronomy, created detailed star catalogues, and invented mathematical concepts that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe for over 1,000 years. They also perfected the art of making their enemies very nervous through superior siege warfare techniques and diplomatic intimidation, skills that would serve them well in the neighbourhood they called home. The geography of Mesopotamia made it a crossroads of trade between Asia, Africa, and Europe, but also made it a tempting target for every ambitious conqueror within camel riding distance. The flat terrain that made agriculture so productive also made the region difficult to defend against determined invaders. This geographic reality would define much of Iraq's subsequent history, blessed with fertile land and strategic location, but cursed with being attractive to every empire builder who happened to be looking for a nice place to expand into. Meanwhile, in the northern part of modern Iraq, the Assyrians were quietly building what would become one of the most efficient military machines in ancient history. Based around their capital at Ashur on the Tigris River, the Assyrians spent centuries perfecting the arts of warfare, administration, and making their enemies surrender through sheer reputation alone. They were the ancient world's equivalent of that one friend who's a little too good at competitive board games and takes winning very seriously indeed. The Assyrians gradually expanded their influence throughout northern Mesopotamia, developing advanced military technologies including iron weapons, siege engines, and cavalry units that made their armies nearly unstoppable in open warfare. They also pioneered several administrative innovations that would influence empire building for centuries to come, including efficient communication systems, professional military organization, and the strategic use of psychological warfare to convince enemies that resistance was futile. Under kings like Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II, the Assyrian Empire expanded far beyond Mesopotamia to include much of the ancient Near East. At its height around 700 BCE, Assyrian territory stretched from Iran to Egypt, making it the largest empire the world had yet seen. They achieved this through a combination of military superiority, administrative efficiency, and a reputation for dealing harshly with rebellion that made most potential enemies decide that peaceful submission was probably the wiser course of action. The Assyrian capital at Nineveh, located near modern Mosul, became one of the ancient world's great cities. Home to perhaps 120,000 people at its peak, it featured magnificent palaces, extensive libraries, and sophisticated water supply systems that supplied the city through an impressive network of canals and aqueducts. The royal library at Nineveh, created by King Ashurbanipal, contained over 30,000 cuneiform tablets and represents one of humanity's earliest attempts at systematic knowledge preservation. However, the Assyrian Empire's very efficiency contained the seeds of its own destruction. The constant warfare required to maintain such a vast territory eventually exhausted even Assyrian resources, while the harsh treatment of conquered peoples created a long list of enemies just waiting for an opportunity for revenge. When that opportunity came in the form of a Babylonian-Median alliance in the late 7th century BCE, the Assyrian Empire collapsed with remarkable speed. The Neo-Babylonian Empire that emerged from Assyria's ashes represented the final flowering of native Mesopotamian civilization. Under kings like Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon once again became a center of learning, culture, and architectural magnificence. The famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, were supposedly built during this period, though archaeologists continue to debate whether they actually existed or were simply ancient tourism marketing that got out of hand. This Neo-Babylonian period also saw the development of increasingly sophisticated mathematical and astronomical knowledge. Babylonian astronomers created detailed observations of planetary movements that would influence scientific thinking for over a millennium. They also refined mathematical concepts, including place value notation and sophisticated geometric calculations that demonstrated a level of abstract thinking that would impress modern mathematicians. The cultural achievements of ancient Mesopotamia during this period extended far beyond mathematics and astronomy. Literature, art, and music flourished in the cities along the Tigris and Euphrates. Epic poems, religious hymns, and historical chronicles were carefully preserved in cuneiform script on clay tablets, creating an extraordinary record of ancient thought and creativity that continues to influence our understanding of early human civilization. Throughout all these political changes and cultural developments, the fundamental geographic realities of Mesopotamia remained constant. The annual flood cycles of the Tigris and Euphrates continued to deposit fertile silt across the landscape, while the region's position at the crossroads of three continents made it a natural centre for trade and cultural exchange. The irrigation systems first developed by the Sumerians were continuously improved and expanded, supporting increasingly large urban populations and creating the agricultural surplus necessary for the spectacular cultural achievements of Babylonian and Assyrian civilization. The legacy of ancient Mesopotamia extends far beyond the borders of modern Iraq. The innovations first developed in this region, writing, urban planning, legal codes, mathematical concepts, astronomical observations, became the foundation for virtually every subsequent civilization. When we write a letter, follow a calendar, or use a legal system, we're using concepts and technologies that were first developed by people living between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers thousands of years ago. As the 6th century BCE drew to a close, the independent history of Mesopotamian civilization was about to end. The Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great was expanding westward, and the Neo-Babylonian Empire would soon fall to these new conquerors from the east. But the cultural and technological foundations laid during the 3 millennia of Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian rule would continue to influence human development long after the last cuneiform tablet was inscribed and the last ziggurat fell into ruin. The story of ancient Mesopotamia reminds us that some of humanity's greatest achievements emerged from people working with the geographic hand they were dealt, turning the annual chaos of river floods into the basis for civilization itself. In doing so, they created something that would outlast every empire that conquered them, the basic tools and concepts that make organized human society possible. Not bad for people whose most advanced transportation technology was a donkey with ambition. Chapter 2: Persian, Hellenistic, and Islamic periods. As we left our Mesopotamian friends in the previous section, they were about to receive some unexpected visitors from the east. In 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great of Persia arrived at Babylon's gates with what can only be described as the ancient world's most successful hostile takeover bid. The Neo-Babylonian Empire was about to become a wholly owned subsidiary of Persia Incorporated. The conquest of Babylon was actually rather anticlimactic by ancient warfare standards. Instead of a massive siege with all the usual carnage and destruction, Cyrus essentially walked into the city through the front door after someone thoughtfully left it unlocked. According to the rather dramatic account by Herodotus, Cyrus diverted the Euphrates River, lowering the water level enough for his troops to wade through the riverbed into the city. Whether this engineering marvel actually happened or was simply ancient propaganda is debatable, but the result was undeniable. Babylon fell to the Persians on October 12th, 539 BCE, and with it went the independence of Mesopotamia. Cyrus proved to be remarkably enlightened for a conqueror, which was probably a relief to the Babylonians who had been bracing themselves for the usual ancient treatment of defeated peoples. Instead of destroying the city or enslaving the population, Cyrus issued what historians now call the Cyrus Cylinder, essentially the world's first charter of human rights. This clay document, now residing in the British Museum, proclaimed that all peoples should be allowed to worship their own gods and return to their homelands. It was revolutionary thinking for the time, though it's worth noting that most revolutionary thinking becomes significantly easier when you've just conquered everyone who might disagree with you. The Persian Empire that now controlled Iraq was the first truly multinational empire, governed through satrapies that allowed local customs to continue under Persian oversight. The system worked remarkably well for over 2 centuries, proving that sometimes the best way to rule an empire is to let people continue doing what they've always done, just with new management. Under Persian rule, Mesopotamia continued to prosper as a centre of learning and culture. The ancient irrigation systems were maintained, cities continued their scholarly traditions, and trade flourished along the Persian royal road. Babylon remained an important administrative centre, though it never quite regained its former status as the centre of the world. This comfortable Persian arrangement might have continued indefinitely if not for the arrival of a young Macedonian king who had apparently never met a country he didn't want to conquer. In 334 BCE, Alexander of Macedon launched his campaign against the Persian Empire, beginning what would become one of history's most spectacular military adventures. Alexander was 22 years old when he began his conquest of Asia, which puts most people's quarter-life crises into perspective. Alexander's journey to Mesopotamia began with a series of victories in Asia Minor and continued through Syria and Egypt, where he was hailed as a liberator by peoples who had grown tired of Persian rule. By 331 BCE, he was ready for his final showdown with the Persian king Darius III. The two armies met at Gaugamela, near modern-day Erbil in northern Iraq, in what would become one of the most decisive battles in ancient history. The Battle of Gaugamela, on October 1st, 331 BCE, was a masterclass in tactical brilliance meeting superior numbers. Darius had assembled a massive army estimated at anywhere from 100,000 to over 1 million soldiers, including war elephants, scythed chariots, and cavalry from every corner of the Persian Empire. It was the ancient equivalent of bringing every weapon you own to a gunfight. Alexander, meanwhile, had about 40,000 troops and the kind of tactical genius that military historians still study today. The battle itself was a testament to the power of good strategy over sheer numbers. Alexander's famous oblique attack, where he led his companion cavalry in a decisive charge that broke through the Persian lines, resulted in the complete collapse of Darius's army. The Persian king fled the field for the second time in his career, apparently having developed an unfortunate habit of strategic retreating at crucial moments. This defeat effectively ended the Persian Empire and opened the path to Babylon for the young Macedonian conqueror. Alexander's entry into Babylon a few weeks later was a remarkable display of ancient public relations. Instead of the typical conquering army behavior of pillaging and destruction, Alexander was greeted as a liberator by crowds of cheering Babylonians. He made sacrifices at the Temple of Marduk, participated in local religious ceremonies, and appointed the Persian general Mazius as satrap of the region. It was a masterful demonstration of how to win hearts and minds, though it helped that he had just decisively defeated their previous rulers. Alexander's treatment of Babylon and its traditions showed a level of cultural sensitivity that was rare among ancient conquerors. He ordered the restoration of temples that had been neglected under Persian rule and made it clear that he intended to preserve rather than destroy the city's ancient heritage. The fact that he chose to make Babylon one of his primary capitals demonstrates how deeply he appreciated the city's symbolic and practical importance. After all, if you're going to rule the world, you might as well do it from somewhere with proper drainage and a good library. Alexander's time in Babylon was cut short by his untimely death in 323 BCE, probably from fever, though theories about his demise range from poisoning to alcoholism to a particularly virulent strain of ancient pneumonia. He died in the city he had chosen as his capital, aged just 32, having created the largest empire in ancient history and then failing to provide any clear instructions about who should inherit it. This oversight would prove to be somewhat problematic for the stability of his conquests. The death of Alexander led to what historians euphemistically call the Wars of Succession, though decades of ambitious generals trying to murder each other might be a more accurate description. After much fighting and political manoeuvring, Alexander's empire was divided among his generals, known as the Diadochi. Mesopotamia eventually fell under the control of Seleucus Nicator, one of Alexander's bodyguards who proved to have excellent survival instincts and even better political timing. The Seleucid Empire that emerged from this chaos controlled a vast territory stretching from Syria to India, with Babylon initially serving as one of its major centres. However, Seleucus soon founded a new capital called Seleucia on Tigris, located near modern Baghdad, which gradually drew population and importance away from ancient Babylon. It was rather like building a shiny new shopping mall next to the old town centre. Eventually, everyone starts going to the new place, and the old one becomes a bit of a tourist attraction. Under Seleucid rule, Mesopotamia experienced a fascinating cultural fusion between Greek traditions and ancient Near Eastern customs. Greek became the administrative language while local traditions continued. Cities were rebuilt with gymnasiums and theatres, but ancient temples continued functioning. The famous astronomer Hipparchus relied heavily on Babylonian observations in developing his theories about celestial movement. The Seleucid Empire, however, proved to be one of those political entities that looked impressive on paper but struggled with the practical realities of governing such a vast and diverse territory. Rebellions, invasions, and internal conflicts gradually reduced Seleucid control over their eastern provinces. By the mid-2nd century BCE, the Parthians, a nomadic Iranian people, had begun expanding westward and would eventually take control of Mesopotamia, bringing yet another change of management to this much-conquered region. The Parthians ruled Mesopotamia from about 150 BCE to 226 CE. They were excellent horse archers who preferred decentralized administration. Under Parthian rule, Mesopotamia became a battlefield between Romans and Parthians, with cities changing hands multiple times and trade routes disrupted by constant warfare. In the early 3rd century CE, the Sassanids overthrew the Parthians and ruled for the next 400 years. The Sassanid Empire represented a Persian Renaissance, with centralized government and Zoroastrianism as the state religion. Under Sassanid rule, Ctesiphon became one of the world's largest cities, rivaling Constantinople in size and magnificence. However, the constant warfare with Byzantium, combined with internal religious and social tensions, gradually weakened the Sassanid Empire. The costs of maintaining massive armies and fortifications along the western frontier drained the imperial treasury, while religious conflicts between Zoroastrians, Christians, and various other groups created internal divisions. By the early 7th century, the empire was economically exhausted and politically fragmented, setting the stage for another dramatic change in Mesopotamia's political landscape. This change came from an entirely unexpected direction, the Arabian Peninsula, where a new religious and political movement had emerged under the leadership of the Prophet Muhammad. The followers of this new faith, Islam, had begun a series of conquests that would transform the Middle East and North Africa. For the Sassanids and Byzantines, who had spent centuries fighting each other, the emergence of Arab Muslim armies represented an entirely new kind of challenge. The Arab conquest of Mesopotamia began in the early 630s CE under Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab. Initial raids succeeded beyond expectations, encouraging larger campaigns. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah in 637 CE, when Muslim armies defeated the main Sassanid force and overcame their fear of war elephants. Following victory at Al-Qadisiyah, Muslim armies captured Ctesiphon, the Sassanid capital. Within 2 years, virtually all of Mesopotamia was under Muslim control. The Arabs established garrison cities at Kufa and Basra, which quickly grew into major urban centres attracting Arab settlers and local converts. The introduction of Islam created fascinating religious and cultural transformation. While Arab conquerors generally allowed Christian and Jewish communities to maintain their faiths for attacks, many locals converted to Islam over following centuries. Arabic gradually replaced Persian as the administrative language, and the region became known as Iraq. The Umayyad Caliphate ruled from Damascus between 661 and 750 CE, treating Iraq as a troublesome province prone to rebellion. The massacre of Ali's son Hussein at Karbala in 680 CE created lasting resistance symbols and established Iraq as a centre of Shia Islamic thought. The Umayyads' response to Iraqi unrest was typically heavy-handed. They appointed harsh governors like al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, who was legendary for his iron-fisted rule and creative approaches to dealing with political dissent. Al-Hajjaj even founded a new city called Wasit, strategically located between Kufa and Basra, to house a permanent Syrian garrison that could keep the local population in line. It was essentially an ancient version of imposing martial law, complete with a custom-built military base. This oppressive Umayyad rule ultimately contributed to their downfall. In 750 CE, a revolutionary movement led by Abu al-Abbas al-Saffah successfully overthrew the Umayyad Caliphate and established the Abbasid dynasty. The Abbasids claimed descent from Abbas ibn Abd al-Muttalib, the uncle of Prophet Muhammad, and they had strong support in Iraq and eastern Iran. Their victory marked the beginning of a new era in which Iraq would become the centre of the Islamic world. The early Abbasid period represented a golden age for Iraq, and its new capital, Baghdad, founded in 762 CE. The circular City of Peace was designed to be the perfect expression of Islamic urban planning. Under Abbasid rule, Iraq experienced unprecedented prosperity and intellectual achievement, with the House of Wisdom becoming a centre for preserving classical texts and advancing human knowledge. The Abbasid period also saw remarkable technological and architectural achievements in Iraq. Advanced irrigation systems were developed to maximize agricultural productivity. Magnificent palaces and mosques were constructed in Baghdad and other cities, and new industrial techniques were pioneered in textiles, metalwork, and ceramics. The Caliph Harun al-Rashid's court, immortalized in the tales of the Arabian Nights, represented the height of Abbasid power and cultural achievement. However, like all golden ages, the Abbasid zenith was not destined to last. By the 9th century, the caliphate faced increasing challenges from provincial governors asserting independence, religious minorities demanding autonomy, and economic problems from maintaining such a vast empire. The very success of Abbasid civilization had created new problems that proved difficult to manage centrally. The story of Iraq under Persian, Hellenistic, and Islamic rule demonstrates how geography and culture can interact with political change to create distinctive historical periods. Each new ruling group brought their own traditions and systems, but the fundamental realities of Mesopotamian geography, the rivers, the fertile soil, the strategic location, continued to shape how people lived and worked in the region. Through all these political transformations, Iraq remained what it had always been, a crossroads of civilizations, a centre of learning and trade, and a place where ambitious empires came to test their ability to govern diverse peoples and manage complex societies. Chapter 3: Ottoman Era and British Mandate. By the 9th century CE, The Abbasid Golden Age was beginning to show some concerning cracks around the edges. Provincial governors were getting a bit too comfortable in their positions. Religious minorities were making increasingly bold demands for autonomy, and the imperial treasury was starting to make those uncomfortable wheezing sounds that large bureaucracies make when they've grown beyond their means. It was the classic imperial problem, success breeding the very complexities that would eventually undermine that success. What nobody in Baghdad was expecting, however, was that the end of their world would come not from internal decay, but from horsemen thundering out of the distant steppes of Mongolia. In 1258 CE, Hulagu Khan, grandson of the legendary Genghis Khan, arrived at Baghdad's gates with what was quite possibly the largest army ever assembled by the Mongol Empire. The Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim probably thought this was just another diplomatic crisis that could be resolved through traditional negotiation and perhaps a bit of tribute. He was spectacularly wrong. The siege that followed was both brief and devastating. The Mongols, who had perfected the art of siege warfare across their conquests from China to Eastern Europe, made short work of Baghdad's fortifications. By February 10th, 1258, the city had fallen, and what followed was one of history's most thorough urban destructions. The House of Wisdom, that magnificent library that had preserved and advanced human knowledge for centuries, was destroyed. Historians report that the Tigris River ran black with ink from the countless manuscripts thrown into its waters and red with the blood of Baghdad's inhabitants. The destruction of Baghdad was so complete that it effectively ended what historians call the Islamic Golden Age. A city that had been home to perhaps 1 million people was reduced to a shadow of its former self. The last Abbasid caliph was executed by the Mongols, wrapped in a carpet and trampled by horses to avoid spilling royal blood directly on the ground, because even in their thorough brutality, the Mongols maintained certain religious protocols. It was rather like being mugged by someone who still said please and thank you. For the next several centuries, Iraq became something of a geopolitical football, passed between various Mongol successor states, Turkmen dynasties, and Persian empires. The Ilkhanate Mongols ruled initially, followed by the Jalayirids, then the Black Sheep and White Sheep Turkmen confederations. Each new ruling group brought their own administrative systems and cultural preferences, though none managed to restore Iraq to anything approaching its former glory. It was like a magnificent palace being repeatedly redecorated by tenants with very different tastes and budgets. The region's fortunes improved somewhat when it was incorporated into the Ottoman Empire during the early 16th century. In 1514 CE, Sultan Selim I defeated the Safavid Persians at the Battle of Chaldiran, bringing most of modern-day Iraq under Ottoman control. The Ottomans, who had built their empire on the principle of efficient administration and religious tolerance, organized Iraq into 3 provinces: Baghdad, Basra, and Mosul. Each province had its own governor and administrative structure, though they all ultimately answered to the Sultan in Constantinople. Under Ottoman rule, Iraq experienced relative stability and gradual recovery from Mongol devastation. The 3 provinces each developed distinct characters: Baghdad as administrative center, Basra as the southern port connecting to Persian Gulf trade, and Mosul as the northern gateway to Anatolia. However, ongoing Ottoman-Persian rivalry meant Iraq served as a frontier battleground, with Baghdad changing hands several times. As Ottoman authority weakened, Iraq came under control of local Mamluk pashas from 1750 to 1831. These military rulers provided stable governance and invested in infrastructure, but faced tribal rebellions and growing European commercial interests in the Persian Gulf. During the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire launched a series of reforms known as the Tanzimat. aimed at modernizing and centralizing the imperial administration. In Iraq, these reforms were implemented most dramatically by Midhat Pasha, who served as governor of Baghdad from 1869 to 1872. Midhat was essentially the Ottoman Empire's version of an efficiency expert, and he transformed Baghdad with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered the joys of urban planning. Midhat Pasha's achievements were impressive by any standard. He demolished sections of Baghdad's medieval walls to allow for urban expansion, built the first bridge across the Tigris in Baghdad since ancient times, established a tramway system, created public parks, set up hospitals and schools, and even founded Iraq's first newspaper. He also implemented new land laws, established municipal councils, and generally brought 19th century administrative practices to a region that had been operating on medieval systems. It was like installing modern plumbing in a historical building, transformative but requiring careful attention to the existing structure. However, these Ottoman reforms, impressive as they were, came too late to restore the empire to its former strength. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was increasingly known as the sick man of Europe, struggling with debt, nationalism, and the rising power of European states. Iraq, despite its oil potential, remained a relatively peripheral part of the empire, valued more for its strategic position than its economic contributions. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 marked the beginning of the end for Ottoman rule in Iraq. When the Ottoman Empire decided to join the Central Powers alongside Germany and Austria-Hungary, it immediately found itself at war with the British Empire, which had significant interests in the Persian Gulf region. The British had been expanding their influence in the area for decades, establishing protectorates over Kuwait and other Gulf states, and they viewed the war as an opportunity to finally secure control over Mesopotamia's oil resources. The British invasion began in November 1914 when forces from India landed at Basra. After initial setbacks including defeat at Kut in 1916, reinforcements captured Baghdad in March 1917. General Maud proclaimed, "The British came not as conquerors but as liberators." Though governing Iraq's diverse populations with competing interests proved more complex than liberation rhetoric suggested. The end of World War I in 1918 left the British in control of Iraq, but uncertain about what to do with it. The League of Nations mandate system provided a legal framework for continued control, but the costs of direct administration were enormous, and Iraqi resistance to foreign rule was growing. The 1920 Iraqi revolt, which spread across much of the country, demonstrated that Iraqis had no intention of passively accepting permanent British control. The revolt was a watershed moment in modern Iraqi history, beginning with tribal uprisings in the south and spreading to include urban nationalists and religious leaders. The rebellion united Iraq's diverse communities in opposition to British rule. The uprising was eventually suppressed by British forces, including the Royal Air Force, but at enormous cost in both money and lives. The revolt convinced British policymakers that direct rule was unsustainable and that some form of indirect control would be necessary. The British solution, developed at the Cairo Conference of 1921, was to establish a constitutional monarchy under British oversight. The challenge was finding a suitable king who would be acceptable to Iraqis while remaining loyal to British interests. The choice fell on Faisal ibn Hussein, a Hashemite prince who had led Arab forces during the war but had been expelled from Syria by the French. Faisal had the advantage of Islamic legitimacy through his descent from the Prophet Muhammad, nationalist credentials from his role in the Arab Revolt, and personal dependence on British support. Faisal's installation as King of Iraq in 1921 was accomplished through a carefully orchestrated referendum that produced a suspiciously enthusiastic 96% approval rating. The new kingdom was governed under a constitutional monarchy with a parliament, but real power remained with the British High Commissioner, who advised the king on all matters affecting British interests. It was essentially a system of remote control governance, where the British operated the machinery of state from behind the scenes. The challenge facing King Faisal was to build legitimacy among Iraqis, while maintaining the British support that kept him on the throne. This required considerable political skill, as he had to navigate between Iraqi nationalist demands for independence and British requirements for continued influence. Faisal proved remarkably adept at this balancing act, gradually expanding Iraqi autonomy while avoiding direct confrontation with his British patrons. He worked to unite Iraq's diverse communities while building modern governmental institutions. The 1920s and early 1930s saw a gradual transition toward Iraqi independence, though always within limits acceptable to British interests. A series of treaties defined the relationship between Britain and Iraq, reducing the formal British role while maintaining British influence over foreign policy, defence and economic matters. The process was rather like teaching someone to drive while keeping your hands ready to grab the steering wheel at any moment. Each treaty negotiation involved complex diplomatic manoeuvring as Iraqi leaders pushed for greater autonomy. Iraqi independence was finally achieved in 1932, when the mandate officially ended and Iraq became a member of the League of Nations. However, independence was more symbolic than real. British advisors remained embedded in the Iraqi government. British military bases continued to operate on Iraqi soil, and British companies maintained control over Iraq's oil resources. The Anglo-Iraqi Treaty of 1930 ensured that Iraq remained firmly within the British sphere of influence. The Hashemite monarchy, established under British auspices, faced constant challenges to its legitimacy throughout the Mandate period. Many Iraqis continued to view the royal family as a British creation, lacking authentic roots in Iraqi society. The concentration of power in Sunni Arab hands systematically alienated the Shia majority and Kurdish minority, while the monarchy's close ties to Britain became increasingly controversial as Arab nationalism gained strength throughout the Middle East. These tensions would prove to be enduring features of Iraqi politics. Throughout this period, Iraq's strategic importance continued to grow dramatically due to its oil resources. The discovery of major oil fields in the 1920s transformed Iraq from a backwater province into a strategic prize coveted by major powers. The Iraq Petroleum Company, controlled by British interests with participation from French and American companies, began large-scale oil production, generating revenues that could fund ambitious modernization projects, but also creating new sources of political tension over the distribution of oil wealth and foreign control of natural resources. The interwar period also saw the emergence of modern Iraqi political parties and intellectual movements that would shape the country's future. Urban, educated Iraqis began developing more sophisticated political ideologies, including Arab nationalism, socialism, and constitutional democracy. Professional associations, literary societies, and political clubs provided venues for developing Iraqi political consciousness, independent of tribal or religious affiliations. These movements would eventually challenge both the monarchy and British influence, though their impact would not be fully felt until after World War II, when a new generation of Iraqi leaders would seek to break free from the constraints of the mandate system. The period from the devastating Mongol destruction of Baghdad to the establishment of British-dominated Iraq represents one of the most dramatic transformations in the entire region's long history. Iraq went from being the center of Islamic civilization to a devastated frontier region, then to a recovering Ottoman province, and finally to a British mandate and nominally independent kingdom. Through all these political changes, the fundamental geographic and cultural realities of Mesopotamia continued to shape how people lived and worked in the region, while new technologies and global economic forces began to transform traditional patterns of life in ways that would have profound implications for Iraq's future development. Chapter 4: Modern Republic and Saddam Era. By the 1950s, the Hashemite monarchy that the British had so carefully constructed was beginning to look rather like a beautiful vintage automobile that nobody actually wanted to drive anymore. King Faisal II was well-meaning but politically inexperienced. His government was dominated by politicians who seemed more interested in British approval than Iraqi welfare, and the general population was increasingly attracted to the revolutionary ideas emanating from Egypt under Gamal Abdel Nasser. It was, as political scientists might say, a recipe for regime change. The change came on the morning of July 14, 1958, when a group of military officers calling themselves the Free Officers Movement decided to take matters into their own hands. Led by Brigadier Abdul Karim Qasim and Colonel Abdul Salam Arif, these officers had originally been ordered to march their units to Jordan to support King Hussein against potential Syrian threats. Instead, they took what military historians call a slight detour and marched on Baghdad, seizing the radio station, the royal palace, and other key government buildings before most people had finished their morning tea. The royal family's fate was swift and brutal. King Faisal II, Crown Prince Abdul Illah, and Prime Minister Nuri al-Said were all killed during the coup, ending 37 years of Hashemite rule in Iraq. The revolutionaries proclaimed the Republic of Iraq over the radio, promising social justice, national independence, and freedom from foreign influence. For many Iraqis, particularly those who had grown tired of British interference and monarchical privilege, it seemed like the dawn of a new era. The fact that it was also the dawn of decades of political instability was not immediately apparent. General Qasim, who became the new Prime Minister, was a fascinating character who embodied both the promise and the contradictions of Iraqi republicanism. Unlike many of his fellow officers who were enthusiastic about pan-Arab unity, Qasim was an Iraqi nationalist who believed that Iraq should focus on its own development rather than merging with Egypt or Syria. This put him at odds with his deputy, Arif, and would eventually create serious political tensions within the revolutionary government. It was rather like starting a business partnership with someone who fundamentally disagreed about what business you should be in. Qasim's domestic policies were genuinely progressive. He launched land reforms, breaking up feudal estates, established worker housing projects, expanded education and healthcare, and granted women new legal rights. He welcomed back political exiles, including Kurdish leader Mustafa Barzani. However, progressive policies require political stability to implement effectively. That stability proved elusive. Qasim faced constant opposition from pan-Arab nationalists wanting union with Egypt, communists, conservatives, and Kurdish autonomy seekers. Managing these competing demands required considerable skill, but Qasim's approach was often heavy-handed and paranoid, undermining the revolution's democratic ideals. The most serious threat to Qasim's government came from a young Ba'ath Party activist named Saddam Hussein, who in 1959 participated in a failed assassination attempt against the Prime Minister. The plot was badly planned and even more badly executed. Saddam was reportedly shot in the leg by his own accomplices and had to flee to Syria, then Egypt. It was hardly the stuff of revolutionary legend, though it would later be mythologized by Ba'athist propaganda as a heroic act of resistance against tyranny. The Ba'ath Party, founded in Syria in the 1940s by intellectuals like Michel Aflaq, advocated a combination of Arab nationalism, socialism, an anti-imperialism that appealed to many educated Arabs frustrated with Western dominance and monarchical rule. In Iraq, the party remained relatively small during the Qasim period, but it was well organized and deeply committed to revolutionary change. The Baathists also had something that many other opposition groups lacked: a willingness to use violence systematically and without much regard for conventional morality. The end for Qasim came in February 1963, when the Ba'ath Party launched what they called the Ramadan Revolution. Unlike the largely bloodless coup of 1958, this was a brutal affair involving house-to-house fighting, mass arrests, and systematic executions of Communist Party members and Qasim supporters. Some sources suggest that the CIA provided lists of communist targets to the Baathists, though this remains a matter of historical debate. What's not debatable is that thousands of people were killed during the few days of fighting and the repressive aftermath. Qasim himself was captured and executed on February 9, 1963, ending nearly 5 years of Republican rule that had promised much but delivered mostly political chaos. The Ba'ath Party installed Abdul Salam Arif, Qasim's former deputy, as president, while Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr became prime minister. However, the Baathists' first attempt at ruling Iraq was almost comically incompetent. They were politically inexperienced, ideologically divided, and spent most of their time fighting among themselves rather than governing the country. The Ba'ath Party's first reign was brief and incompetent. In November 1963, President Arif staged a counter-coup, removing the Ba'ath from power. Al-Sadi was exiled, other leaders imprisoned, and the National Guard disbanded. Iraq was now ruled by Arab nationalist officers sympathetic to Egypt, but less committed to revolutionary transformation. The Arif government, which lasted until 1968, represented a period of relative stability in Iraqi politics. The country remained a republic with pan-Arab rhetoric, but the focus shifted toward more pragmatic concerns like economic development and administrative reform. Relations with Egypt improved significantly, and there was even talk of eventual political union, though this never materialized. More importantly, the systematic political violence that had characterized both the Qasim and Ba'athist periods largely ceased. However, the Arif era also demonstrated the fundamental weakness of Iraqi political institutions. When Abdul Salam Arif died in a helicopter crash in 1966, power simply passed to his brother Abdul Rahman Arif, not through any constitutional process but because the military supported the transition. This established a precedent that would plague Iraqi politics for decades. Political legitimacy derived from military backing rather than popular support or constitutional procedures. Meanwhile, the Ba'ath Party used opposition time wisely. Led by al-Bakr and Saddam Hussein, they reorganized from fractious intellectuals into a disciplined political machine, studying their mistakes and building effective organizational structures. Saddam proved particularly talented at conspiratorial politics and building personal loyalty networks. The opportunity came in July 1968, when al-Bakr and a coalition of Ba'athist and nationalist officers staged another coup against the Arif government. This time, however, the Ba'athists were better prepared. Within 2 weeks of seizing power, they had eliminated their non-Ba'athist partners in a second, bloodless coup that left al-Bakr as president and the Ba'ath Party in complete control. It was a masterful demonstration of revolutionary technique, though hardly reassuring for anyone who valued political stability. The second Ba'athist era began with al-Bakr as the nominal leader, but real power increasingly lay with Saddam Hussein, who became the party's deputy secretary general and effectively controlled the internal security apparatus. Saddam had learned important lessons from the failures of the 1963 government. Instead of immediately launching radical reforms that would create opposition, the new Ba'ath regime moved gradually to consolidate control while building popular support through pragmatic policies. The early 1970s saw significant improvements in Iraqi living standards as oil revenues increased and government invested in infrastructure, education, and social services. The Ba'ath Party also negotiated the March 1970 Kurdish Autonomy Agreement. Briefly, Iraq seemed to achieve the stability and development that had eluded it since independence. Behind the scenes, however, Saddam was systematically building a police state apparatus that would eventually make Iraq one of the world's most repressive societies. The party created an extensive network of informants and secret police that monitored virtually every aspect of Iraqi life. Political opposition was ruthlessly suppressed, often through torture and execution. The regime also began the process of personalizing power around Saddam, who gradually eliminated rivals and potential threats within the Ba'ath Party itself. The transformation became complete in July 1979, when al-Bakr announced his resignation due to ill health and transferred power to Saddam. Whether this was a voluntary retirement or a carefully orchestrated coup remains unclear, but the result was the same. Saddam Hussein became president of Iraq, regional secretary of the Ba'ath Party, and chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council. One of his first acts was to stage a party meeting where he dramatically announced the discovery of a Syrian-backed conspiracy and proceeded to have several prominent Ba'athists arrested and executed. The 1979 purge was a chilling demonstration of Saddam's methods and priorities. The entire session was videotaped, with Saddam calmly smoking a cigar while reading out the names of alleged conspirators who were then escorted from the room to face execution. It was political theatre designed to terrorize potential opponents and establish Saddam's absolute authority within the party. The message was clear. Loyalty to Saddam was not just expected but essential for survival. With domestic opposition crushed, Saddam turned his attention to regional affairs. In September 1980, Iraqi forces invaded Iran, beginning what would become one of the longest and most destructive wars of the 20th century. Saddam's calculation was that Iran, weakened by the chaos following the 1979 Islamic Revolution, would be unable to resist a swift Iraqi victory that would establish Iraq as the dominant power in the Persian Gulf region. The Iran-Iraq War lasted until August 1988 and proved catastrophic for both countries. Initial Iraqi advances bogged down into World War I-style trench warfare with massive casualties. Iran's larger population allowed it to absorb enormous losses while pushing Iraqi forces back, threatening Saddam's regime by the mid-80s. Facing potential defeat, Saddam authorized systematic use of chemical weapons against Iranian forces, making Iraq the first country since World War I to employ such weapons on a large scale. Beginning in 1983, Iraqi forces used mustard gas, sarin, and other agents in hundreds of attacks. The most notorious occurred at Halabja in March 1988, when nerve gas killed thousands of Kurdish civilians in retaliation for Kurdish support of Iran. The war finally ended in August 1988 with both countries exhausted and their boundaries essentially unchanged from where they had been 8 years earlier. Iraq had avoided defeat but at enormous cost. Hundreds of thousands of casualties, massive foreign debt, and an economy devastated by military spending. The war also transformed Iraqi society, creating a generation of veterans traumatized by prolonged conflict, and a government increasingly dependent on repression to maintain control. Saddam attempted to address Iraq's economic problems through the invasion of Kuwait in August 1990, hoping to seize Kuwaiti oil wealth and establish Iraqi dominance over Gulf oil exports. However, This miscalculation was even more disastrous than the invasion of Iran. A US-led coalition quickly assembled to defend Saudi Arabia and liberate Kuwait, launching a devastating air campaign against Iraq in January 1991, followed by a ground offensive that crushed Iraqi forces within days. The Gulf War's aftermath proved equally destructive. UN sanctions remained throughout the 1990s, restricting food and medicine imports. Combined with Saddam's military spending priorities, this created humanitarian catastrophe. Rebellions by Shia Arabs and Kurds were brutally suppressed, often with chemical weapons and village destruction. By the late 1990s, Iraq had become a failed state where government maintained power through force but couldn't provide basic services. Infrastructure collapsed, education and healthcare deteriorated, while much of the population survived through informal economic networks. The contrast with early 1970s prosperity was stark. Throughout this period, Saddam presented himself as the defender of Iraqi independence against foreign aggression and domestic treachery. Regime propaganda emphasized Iraq's ancient history, positioning Saddam as successor to Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar. This nationalist rhetoric resonated with some Iraqis feeling humiliated by foreign intervention, even as they suffered under dictatorship. The final phase began after September 11, 2001, which changed American attitudes toward Middle Eastern threats. Although Iraq had no connection to the attacks, the Bush administration became convinced that Saddam's alleged weapons programs posed unacceptable threats. Despite international opposition, the United States and Britain invaded Iraq in March 2003. The invasion itself was swift and decisive, with Baghdad falling within 3 weeks and Saddam's government collapsing. However, military victory masked the complexity of what would follow. Iraq under Saddam had been a brittle dictatorship held together by fear. Once removed, underlying sectarian, ethnic and regional divisions quickly emerged. The period from 1958 to 2003 represents one of the most turbulent eras in Iraqi history, characterized by revolutionary upheavals, military coups, devastating wars, and systematic repression. The promise of the 1958 revolution, independence, social justice, and national development, was gradually abandoned in favor of increasingly authoritarian rule that prioritized regime survival over popular welfare. The tragedy was that Iraq had enormous potential for prosperity and stability, blessed with vast oil reserves, fertile agricultural land, and a well-educated population, but political dysfunction prevented that potential from being realized. Chapter 5. Post-2003, Iraq and Contemporary Challenges. The March 2003 invasion of Iraq was, in many ways, like performing surgery with a sledgehammer, technically effective at removing the immediate problem, but somewhat lacking in finesse regarding what came next. Within 3 weeks, American and British forces had toppled Saddam Hussein's government, captured Baghdad, and apparently achieved their primary military objectives. President George W. Bush famously declared, "Mission accomplished" from the deck of an aircraft carrier in May. Unfortunately, the mission that had actually been accomplished was the relatively easy part. The Coalition Provisional Authority, established under American diplomat Paul Bremer, faced the unenviable task of governing a country that had just experienced the complete collapse of all its institutions. Rather than gradually transitioning power or working with existing structures, Bremer made 2 decisions that would haunt Iraq for decades: disbanding the Iraqi military and implementing comprehensive de-Baathification. These policies effectively unemployed several 100,000 trained soldiers and civil servants simultaneously, creating what economists might call a challenging labour market situation. The logic behind these decisions was understandable. The Ba'ath Party and Saddam's military had been instruments of oppression, and creating a clean break seemed necessary for democratic transformation. However, the practical result was that Iraq suddenly lacked anyone with experience running power plants, managing hospitals, or maintaining basic infrastructure. It was rather like firing an entire city's government and police force on the same day, then expressing surprise when services deteriorated and crime increased. By the summer of 2003, it became clear that the post-war phase would be considerably more complicated than the invasion itself. Insurgent attacks against coalition forces began almost immediately, initially carried out by former Ba'athist officials and military officers who had little else to do with their time. These were soon joined by foreign fighters, including a Jordanian militant named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who had established the group that eventually became ISIS. The insurgency was like a multi-layered cake of grievances, with each layer representing different groups with different motivations but a shared interest in making life difficult for the occupying forces. The insurgency might have remained manageable if it had stayed focused on attacking coalition troops. However, Zarqawi had grander ambitions, deliberately targeting Shia civilians to provoke sectarian conflict. His strategy was brilliantly diabolical. By killing Shias, he hoped to provoke retaliation against Sunnis, which would force Sunnis to seek his protection. The plan worked catastrophically well. The February 2006 bombing of the Al-Askari Mosque in Samarra, one of Shia Islam's holiest sites, triggered exactly the sectarian warfare Zarqawi had sought. Shia militias, particularly Muqtada al-Sadr's Mahdi army, began systematic attacks on Sunni civilians who responded with their own revenge attacks. Baghdad became a city where your neighborhood's religious composition could determine whether you lived or died, and millions of Iraqis fled their homes to escape the violence. The period from 2006 to 2008 represented the nadir of post-invasion Iraq. Daily death tolls regularly exceeded 100 people, with bodies dumped in the streets showing signs of torture. Entire neighborhoods were ethnically cleansed as Sunni and Shia militias competed for territorial control. The Iraqi government, led by Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, seemed powerless to stop the violence, partly because many of the militias doing the killing were affiliated with political parties in his own coalition. The American response was the surge strategy, implemented by General David Petraeus in 2007, deploying an additional 30,000 troops and fundamentally changing coalition tactics. Instead of operating from fortified bases, American forces moved into Iraqi neighborhoods, working with local leaders and providing civilian security. The surge coincided with the Awakening movement, where Sunni tribal leaders, disgusted by al-Qaeda's brutality, switched sides and began cooperating with coalition forces. By late 2008, the surge strategy had dramatically reduced violence levels, and Iraq seemed to be stabilizing. American forces began withdrawing under President Obama, completing their withdrawal in December 2011. However, the apparent stability masked underlying problems that would soon resurface. The sectarian quota system, established during the occupation, where government positions were allocated based on religious and ethnic identity rather than competence, institutionalized the very divisions that had fueled the civil war. Prime Minister Maliki, emboldened by the American withdrawal, increasingly marginalized Sunni political leaders and relied heavily on Shia-dominated security forces. His government's sectarian policies created the perfect conditions for the emergence of an even more dangerous threat than al-Qaeda in Iraq. The group that would become ISIS had been weakened but not destroyed, and it found new opportunities in the chaos of neighboring Syria's civil war. The rise of ISIS represented a terrifying evolution of the original al-Qaeda in Iraq model. Led by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the group declared itself the Islamic State in June 2014 and launched a lightning campaign that captured vast territories across Iraq and Syria. The fall of Mosul in June 2014 was particularly shocking. Iraq's second largest city fell to fewer than 2,000 ISIS fighters, while 30,000 Iraqi troops simply melted away without putting up serious resistance. ISIS was unlike previous terrorist organizations. Rather than operating as a clandestine network, it controlled territory roughly the size of Britain, governed millions of people, and generated revenue through oil sales, taxation, and extortion. The group's sophisticated propaganda machine attracted foreign fighters from around the world, while its extreme brutality, including public executions, sexual slavery, and genocide against Yazidi and Christian minorities, shocked even observers accustomed to Middle Eastern violence. The international response to ISIS was swift but complex. The United States led a coalition of more than 60 countries in conducting airstrikes against ISIS targets, while providing training and equipment to Iraqi security forces and Kurdish Peshmerga fighters. Iran also intervened heavily, providing weapons and advisors to Shia militias and Iraqi government forces. The result was a strange situation where American and Iranian forces were effectively fighting on the same side, though maintaining the pretense that they weren't coordinating their efforts. The war against ISIS took 3 years and devastated much of northern and western Iraq. Cities like Mosul, Ramadi, and Fallujah were reduced to rubble, while hundreds of thousands of civilians fled their homes. The final battle for Mosul lasted 9 months and left the ancient city's old town looking like it had been hit by an earthquake. When ISIS was finally defeated in Iraq in December 2017, the victory came at enormous cost in both human lives and physical destruction. The post-ISIS period has been characterized by ongoing political dysfunction and endemic corruption that makes the Saddam era's problems seem almost quaint by comparison. Iraq's political system, based on sectarian and ethnic quotas, encourages politicians to focus on enriching their communities and themselves rather than building national institutions. The result has been a kleptocracy where public funds routinely disappear into private accounts, while basic services like electricity and clean water remain unreliable. Recent Iraqi politics has been dominated by figures like Muqtada al-Sadr, the mercurial Shia cleric whose militia fought both American forces and ISIS, and whose political movement appeals to poor Shias frustrated with corruption. Al-Sadr's ability to mobilize hundreds of thousands gives him enormous influence, but his unpredictable behavior repeatedly destabilizes the political system. The 2019 protests that swept across Iraq represented a new generation of Iraqis demanding fundamental political change. Unlike previous demonstrations that were organized along sectarian lines, these protests explicitly rejected the entire post-2003 political system. Protesters, many of them young Shias from southern Iraq, called for an end to corruption, better public services, and genuine sovereignty free from both American and Iranian interference. The government's violent response, which killed hundreds of demonstrators, only intensified public anger. Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi, who came to power in May 2020 following the protest movement, exemplified both the possibilities and limitations of Iraqi politics. A former journalist and intelligence chief with a reputation for integrity, al-Kadhimi promised to fight corruption and prepare for early elections. However, he lacked a strong political base and found himself constrained by the same sectarian parties and Iranian-backed militias that had dominated Iraqi politics since 2003. Al-Kadhimi's anti-corruption campaign illustrates the challenges facing any Iraqi leader who tries to reform the system. While he arrested numerous mid-level officials and froze suspicious bank accounts, he couldn't touch the senior politicians who control the major parties without risking his own government's collapse. Several high-profile corruption cases, including the theft of $2.5 billion from the tax authority, demonstrated the scale of institutional dysfunction while highlighting the impunity enjoyed by well-connected criminals. The current Prime Minister, Mohammed Shia al-Sudani, who took office in October 2022, faces similar challenges. While al-Sudani has delivered on some basic services, he remains constrained by the same dysfunctional political system and Iranian-backed parties that have dominated Iraq since 2003. Iran's influence in contemporary Iraq represents one of the most significant unintended consequences of the American invasion. Iranian-backed militias, organized as the Popular Mobilization Forces, played a crucial role in defeating ISIS, but have since become a state within a state. These groups control significant portions of Iraq's borders, operate their own economic networks, and maintain independent military capabilities that often challenge the authority of the official government. The relationship between Iraq and its neighbours remains complicated by the country's internal divisions and strategic importance. Turkey maintains dozens of military outposts in northern Iraq, ostensibly to combat Kurdish separatists, but effectively establishing a buffer zone under Turkish control. Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states view Iran's influence in Iraq with deep suspicion, but have struggled to develop effective counter-strategies that don't further destabilize the region. Perhaps most tragically, ordinary Iraqis continue to suffer from problems that should have been solved decades ago. Despite sitting atop some of the world's largest oil reserves, Iraq struggles to provide reliable electricity, clean water, and basic healthcare to its citizens. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 50 degrees Celsius, but rolling blackouts mean that air conditioning becomes a luxury rather than a necessity. The contrast between Iraq's natural wealth and its institutional poverty represents one of the great development failures of the modern era. The brain drain that began during the Saddam years has accelerated dramatically since 2003. Iraq's educated middle class, doctors, engineers, academics and professionals, has largely emigrated, leaving behind a society increasingly divided between political elites who profit from dysfunction and ordinary citizens who bear the costs. The Iraqi diaspora now numbers in the millions, representing a massive loss of human capital that will take generations to replace. Looking toward the future, Iraq faces the challenge of building effective institutions while managing the competing demands of its neighbours, the expectations of its citizens, and the legacy of 2 decades of conflict. The country's youth, who represent a majority of the population, have known only war, occupation, sectarian conflict, and political dysfunction. Their frustration with the existing system drives periodic protest movements, but translating that anger into sustainable political change has proved extremely difficult. The coronavirus pandemic added another layer of complexity to Iraq's challenges, straining an already weak healthcare system and devastating an economy dependent on oil revenues. The combination of public health crisis, economic recession, and political instability created what development experts call a perfect storm of governance challenges that would test even well-functioning states. Today's Iraq embodies both the possibilities and perils of political transformation in the modern Middle East. The country has held regular elections since 2005, maintained a relatively free press, and avoided the complete state collapse experienced by Syria or Libya. However, democracy without effective governance has created new forms of oppression, where citizens must navigate corrupt bureaucracies and sectarian militias instead of a single dictator's whims. The most sobering aspect of Iraq's post-2003 experience is how much easier it proved to destroy existing institutions than to build new ones. Saddam Hussein's dictatorship was eliminated in 3 weeks, but creating effective alternatives has taken more than 2 decades and remains incomplete. This lesson has profound implications not just for Iraq, but for anyone contemplating the use of military force to promote political change in complex societies. The story of post-Saddam Iraq is ultimately a reminder that geography and history matter more than good intentions or military superiority. The Tigris and Euphrates continue to flow through the same landscape that has witnessed the rise and fall of countless empires, but the ancient challenge of governing Mesopotamia's diverse populations remains as difficult today as it was 4,000 years ago. Whether Iraq's current generation will finally solve this puzzle remains to be seen, but their efforts will determine not just their own country's future, but the stability of an entire region that can ill afford another failed state. Chapter 6: Geography, Culture, and Modern Life. After travelling through 5,000 years of Iraqi history, from ancient Sumer to contemporary politics, it's worth stepping back to consider the geographical and cultural foundations that have remained constant while empires rise and fall. Iraq's story is ultimately inseparable from its landscape, and understanding modern Iraqi life requires appreciating how geography continues to shape human experience in ways both profound and mundane. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers remain the country's defining geographical features, just as they were when the first cities emerged along their banks. These rivers originate in the mountains of eastern Turkey, flow through portions of Syria and Iran, then converge at the Iraqi city of Al-Qurna to form the Shatt al-Arab waterway before emptying into the Persian Gulf. The annual cycle of flooding and recession that once enabled Mesopotamian agriculture continues today, though it's now managed through an elaborate system of dams, canals, and irrigation projects that would have impressed ancient hydraulic engineers. Modern Iraq encompasses roughly 437,000 square kilometres, about the size of California, and can be divided into 5 main geographical regions. The northwestern plains between the upper Tigris and Euphrates, known in Arabic as Al Jazeera or the island, consist of rolling hills and steppes that support both agriculture and livestock. The northeastern highlands, part of the Zagros mountain chain that extends through Iran and Afghanistan, rise to over 12,000 feet and provide crucial watershed for the river system. The central alluvial plains, stretching from Baghdad southward to the Persian Gulf, represent the heart of agricultural Iraq. Here the 2 rivers meander through flat terrain, depositing fertile silt but also carrying dangerous levels of salt that have challenged farmers since ancient times. The western and southwestern regions belong to the Arabian Desert, a sparsely populated expanse of rocky plateaus and sandy valleys that extends into Jordan and Saudi Arabia. Finally, the southern marshlands, where the rivers approach the sea, create one of the Middle East's largest wetland ecosystems. Iraq's climate presents challenges that would test anyone's patience. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 50 degrees Celsius, that's 122 degrees Fahrenheit, while winter brings brief but occasionally intense cold snaps. The country receives virtually no rainfall from June through September, making winter precipitation absolutely crucial for agriculture and water supplies. It's a climate that demands either elaborate irrigation systems or considerable stoicism from its inhabitants, and Iraqis have developed both in abundance. The discovery of oil in the 1920s fundamentally altered Iraq's economic geography, though not always in ways that benefited ordinary citizens. Iraq possesses the world's 5th largest proven oil reserves, concentrated primarily in the southern regions around Basra and in the northern areas near Kirkuk. These vast underground deposits formed over millions of years by ancient marine life, have made Iraq theoretically one of the world's wealthiest countries, while simultaneously creating what economists call resource curse problems that have plagued governance for decades. Contemporary environmental challenges reflect both natural constraints and human mismanagement. Water flow in the Tigris and Euphrates has declined by 30 to 40% over recent decades due to climate change and upstream dam construction by Turkey and Iran. The famous Mesopotamian marshes have shrunk by over 80% since the 1970s. Half of Iraq's farmland now faces desertification, creating food security challenges for a population approaching 45 million people. Despite these environmental pressures, Iraqi culture maintains deep connections to the land and its seasonal rhythms. Date palm cultivation, practiced continuously for over 5,000 years, remains both economically important and culturally symbolic. Iraq produces some of the world's finest dates, with over 600 varieties grown primarily in the southern oases. The date palm appears in Iraqi poetry, proverbs, and folk tales as a symbol of persistence and generosity, much like the Iraqi people themselves. The marshlands of southern Iraq continue to support the Mardan or marsh Arabs, whose traditional lifestyle represents one of the world's oldest continuous human adaptations to aquatic environments. These communities build houses from reed bundles, navigate shallow waters in narrow boats, and maintain agricultural practices that would be recognizable to ancient Sumerians. Iraqi cuisine reflects the country's agricultural geography and cultural complexity, blending Arab, Persian, Turkish, and Kurdish influences into something distinctively Mesopotamian. Meals typically center around rice or flatbread, accompanied by stews made from whatever vegetables and proteins are locally available. Mazgoof, grilled carp caught from the Tigris or Euphrates, represents Iraq's national dish, while klecha pastries filled with dates connect contemporary dining to ancient agricultural traditions. Tea culture, borrowed from the Ottomans and Persians, provides the social lubrication that keeps Iraqi communities functioning despite political tensions. The linguistic landscape reveals Iraq's ethnic complexity. Arabic serves as the official language and is spoken by roughly 75% of the population, though Iraqi Arabic has distinctive features that reflect centuries of interaction with other languages. Kurdish, spoken by about 20% of Iraqis, serves as a second official language in the autonomous Kurdistan region. Smaller communities speak Turkmen, Neo-Aramaic, Armenian, and other languages, creating a multilingual society where many people routinely switch between languages depending on context. Religious diversity adds another layer to Iraqi cultural complexity. While approximately 95% of Iraqis are Muslim, the country includes Christians, Yazidis, Mandaeans, and followers of other faiths. The Shia majority south includes the holy cities of Najaf and Karbala, which draw millions of pilgrims annually. Christian communities maintain ancient traditions and speak languages that descend from Aramaic. The Yazidi community, concentrated in the Sinjar mountains of northern Iraq, practices one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions, combining elements that predate Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. Their survival through centuries of persecution demonstrates the resilience of minority communities in a region that has seen countless religious and political upheavals. The Mandaeans, followers of John the Baptist who maintain ancient Gnostic traditions, represent another example of how Iraq has preserved religious traditions that disappeared elsewhere. Kurdish culture in northern Iraq maintains distinctive traditions while participating in broader Iraqi society. Kurdish communities celebrate Nowruz, the Persian New Year, with bonfires and festivities that mark the arrival of spring. Their mountainous homeland supports different agricultural practices than the river plains, emphasizing livestock herding and orchard cultivation. Kurdish music, dance, and storytelling traditions reflect the community's semi-nomadic heritage and their long struggle for cultural autonomy. Iraqi artistic traditions demonstrate remarkable continuity with ancient Mesopotamian aesthetics. Contemporary Iraqi artists often incorporate motifs from cylinder seals, ziggurats, and cuneiform writing into modern paintings and sculptures. The tradition of metalworking, particularly copper crafts, continues in Baghdad's ancient markets, where craftsmen use techniques passed down through generations. Calligraphy, both Arabic and Kurdish, transforms written language into visual art, decorating mosques, homes, and public buildings throughout the country. Music remains central to Iraqi cultural life, with the Makam tradition representing one of the Arab world's most sophisticated musical forms. Iraqi maqam combines complex rhythms, intricate melodies, and improvisation within strict structural frameworks requiring years of training to master. Contemporary Iraqi music blends traditional instruments like the oud and qanan with modern influences, creating sounds that appeal to younger generations while maintaining connections to classical traditions. Family structures in Iraq reflect both traditional values and modern pressures. Extended families often share households or maintain close neighborhood ties, providing support networks that become crucial during times of economic hardship or political instability. Marriage customs vary between communities but typically involve elaborate celebrations that can last several days, demonstrating family wealth and social connections. Children are expected to respect elders and contribute to family welfare, creating strong intergenerational bonds that help preserve cultural traditions. Education holds enormous importance in Iraqi culture, reflecting ancient Mesopotamian traditions of scholarship and learning. Despite decades of conflict and institutional breakdown, Iraqi families make tremendous sacrifices to ensure their children receive education. The country's literacy rates, while damaged by recent upheavals, remain higher than many neighboring nations, and Iraqi universities continue to produce doctors, engineers, and intellectuals despite challenging circumstances. Contemporary Iraqi society grapples with the tension between traditional values and modern aspirations. Young Iraqis, who represent a majority of the population, navigate between respecting family traditions and pursuing individual goals. Social media and global connectivity expose them to international cultures, while family and community expectations emphasize local customs. This generational dynamic creates both creative energy and social friction as Iraqi society evolves. Urban life in Baghdad, Basra, Mosul, and other major cities reflects Iraq's complex modernization process. These cities blend ancient neighborhoods with modern developments, traditional markets with contemporary shopping centers. Street life remains vibrant despite security concerns, with tea houses serving as informal social centers where politics and gossip are endlessly discussed. Rural life varies significantly across Iraq's different regions. Farming communities along the rivers maintain irrigation systems and agricultural practices that connect them to their ancient heritage, while mountain villages preserve pastoral traditions adapted to harsh terrain. Desert communities have largely abandoned traditional nomadic lifestyles for settled agriculture or urban migration, though Bedouin cultural values emphasizing honor, hospitality, and tribal loyalty remain influential. The role of women in Iraqi society reflects both Islamic traditions and pre-Islamic customs, complicated by decades of political upheaval. Women in urban areas often pursue higher education and professional careers, while rural women may maintain more traditional domestic roles. The country has produced prominent female poets, doctors, and political figures, though social pressures and security concerns limit women's participation in public life compared to pre-war periods. Iraqi hospitality remains legendary throughout the Middle East, with guests treated as divine blessings regardless of the host's economic circumstances. This tradition of generosity, deeply rooted in Bedouin culture and reinforced by Islamic teachings, creates social bonds that transcend sectarian and ethnic divisions. Even during the worst periods of conflict, Iraqis have maintained reputations for welcoming strangers and sharing whatever resources they possess. Sports, particularly soccer, provide common ground that unites Iraqis across sectarian and ethnic lines. Iraq's national soccer team achieved legendary status by winning the 2007 Asian Cup during sectarian violence, providing a rare moment of national unity. Wrestling and other traditional sports also maintain popularity. The challenge of preserving Iraqi cultural heritage while building modern institutions remains ongoing. Museums, libraries, and archaeological sites have suffered extensive damage from wars, looting, and neglect, representing incalculable losses to world civilization. International efforts to recover stolen artifacts and restore damaged sites compete with immediate needs for healthcare, education, and infrastructure development. Looking toward the future, Iraq faces the challenge of leveraging its geographical advantages while overcoming institutional weaknesses. The country's location at the crossroads of Asia, Africa, and Europe should provide economic opportunities, while its oil reserves offer potential development capital. However, realizing these advantages requires effective governance, environmental sustainability, and social cohesion that have proven elusive for decades. The Iraqi diaspora, numbering in the millions, maintains strong connections to homeland culture while adapting to new environments. Iraqi restaurants and cultural centres in London, Detroit, Stockholm, and other cities preserve traditions while introducing Iraqi culture to international communities. These diaspora connections create networks that could contribute to Iraq's reconstruction. Climate change presents particular challenges for Iraq, whose geography makes it especially vulnerable to rising temperatures and changing precipitation patterns. Adapting agricultural practices, managing water resources, and developing renewable energy will require the same innovative spirit that enabled ancient Mesopotamians to create civilization in a challenging environment. Ultimately, Iraq's story demonstrates how geography provides both opportunities and constraints that human ingenuity can address but never completely overcome. The Tigris and Euphrates will continue flowing long after current political arrangements disappear, carrying both fertile silt and dissolved salts just as they have for millennia. The challenge for contemporary Iraqis is learning from their ancestors' successes while avoiding their failures, building institutions that can harness geographical advantages while managing environmental risks. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Iraqi culture is its persistence through incredible adversity. After experiencing foreign invasion, civil war, sectarian violence, terrorist occupation, economic sanctions, and environmental degradation, Iraqi communities have maintained their essential character. Children still learn traditional songs, families still gather for elaborate meals, craftsmen still practice ancient techniques, and poets still compose verses that would be recognizable to medieval Baghdad intellectuals. This cultural continuity suggests that whatever political arrangements emerge in coming decades, the essential elements of Iraqi civilization will endure. The land between the two rivers has witnessed the rise and fall of countless empires, each leaving traces in the archaeological record and cultural memory. Contemporary Iraq represents just the latest chapter in this ongoing story, and while current challenges seem overwhelming, they are hardly unprecedented in Mesopotamian terms. For those of us listening to this account from comfortable beds in peaceful countries, Iraq's story offers both inspiration and sobering reflection. the creativity, resilience, and hospitality that characterize Iraqi culture demonstrate human potential at its finest, while the political dysfunction and violence of recent decades illustrate how quickly civilized society can unravel when institutions fail. Understanding Iraq means appreciating both possibilities, recognizing that the land that gave birth to civilization continues struggling to find sustainable paths forward in an increasingly complex world.